Story 1. The Cut Breaker. Story 1. The Cut Breaker. I work as a paramedic in Detroit. My shifts are grueling. 12 to 14 hours of adrenaline, blood, and chaos. By the time I get home, usually around 2 a.m., I'm a zombie. I live in a small, single-story ranch house in a suburb called Royal Oak. It's a safe neighborhood, mostly retirees and young families. My wife, Sarah, is a light sleeper, so I have a routine. Park on the street so the garage door doesn't wake her, slip in the side door, grab a beer, and decompress in the living room with the TV on mute. Last November, on a freezing Tuesday night, I followed the routine perfectly. I cracked open a Stella, sank into the recliner, and let out a long sigh. The house was warm and silent. Then, pop. It wasn't a loud noise, just the soft, distinct sound of a circuit breaker tripping. The TV died. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The living room plunged into pitch-black darkness. "Great," I muttered. I waited for a second, thinking maybe the power grid surged. But when I looked out the front window, the streetlights were on. The neighbor's porch light across the street was blazing. It was just my house. I grabbed my phone for a flashlight and went to the back door to check the breaker box, which is mounted on the exterior wall of the garage. I stepped out into the biting cold air. The wind was howling. I walked around to the side of the house. I shined my light on the gray metal panel of the breaker box. My stomach dropped. The panel door was wide open, and lying in the snow directly beneath it was a pair of bolt cutters. This wasn't a trip. Someone had physically pulled the main lever. I reached out to flip it back on, but then I stopped. A thought, cold and sharp as the wind, pierced through my exhaustion. If they cut the power, they want me to come outside. I turned around to go back inside. I grabbed the handle of the side door. Locked. I tried the front door. Locked. I had just walked out of that door 30 seconds ago. It doesn't lock itself. Someone was inside. They had waited for me to step out to check the power, and then they had locked me out. Panic surged through me. "Sarah!" I ran to the living room window and cupped my hands against the glass. Inside, 2 beams of light were cutting through the darkness. Flashlights. They were moving fast, sweeping over the furniture, heading down the hallway toward the bedrooms. "No!" I screamed, banging on the glass. They ignored me. They knew I couldn't get in. I needed to wake Sarah up before they got to her. I sprinted to the bedroom window on the far side of the house. It was high up, too high to reach without a ladder. I looked around frantically. The garden bed was covered in decorative river rocks. I grabbed a handful. Crack! I threw the first rock. It bounced off the siding. Crash! The second rock hit the window pane. It didn't break, but it made a loud thud. A moment later, the blinds shifted. Sarah's face appeared, pale and confused in the moonlight. "Open the window!" I hissed, gesturing wildly. She unlocked it and slid it up. "Mark? What are you doing outside?" "Listen to me," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Someone is in the house. 2 men. They cut the power. Get in the closet. Lock the door. Do not come out until I say so." "Go!" Her eyes went wide. She didn't ask questions. She disappeared from the window instantly. I pulled out my phone to dial 911. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped it in the snow. I scrambled to pick it up, cursing. As I dialed, I heard a sound from inside the bedroom. Boom! The bedroom door being kicked open. I pulled myself up on the window ledge, peering through the screen. A flashlight beam swept across the bed where Sarah had been sleeping seconds ago. Then, a man stepped into view. He was wearing all black, a ski mask, and tactical gloves. In his right hand, glinting in the flashlight beam, was a silver revolver. He swept the room with the gun. "Check under the bed," a muffled voice said from the hallway. The man knelt down. He lifted the duvet. Nothing. He stood up and walked toward the closet. My heart stopped. I gripped the windowsill so hard my fingernails broke. If he opened that door... He reached for the closet knob. Then, sirens. Wailing, beautiful sirens in the distance. The man froze. He looked at his partner in the hallway. "Cops, move!" They turned and bolted out of the room. I heard the back door crash open seconds later. I stayed at the window, screaming Sarah's name until the police kicked down the front door. They never caught them. They took jewelry, a laptop, and my spare car keys. But the detective told me something that still keeps me awake at night. The bolt cutters I found by the breaker box. They weren't used to cut the lock on the panel. They were used to cut the phone line. They thought we still had a landline. They wanted to make sure we couldn't call for help from inside. We moved a month later. I bought a condo on the 4th floor. I don't have a backyard anymore, and I don't have a breaker box on the outside wall. And I check the closets every single night before I go to sleep. Story 2. The Voice on the Landing. Story 2. The Voice on the Landing. I'm a freelance video editor. About 2 years ago, I hit a rough patch financially and moved into my aunt's basement apartment in Forks, Washington. Yes, the Twilight Town. But in reality, it's just a quiet logging community surrounded by millions of acres of dark, wet forest. My aunt travels a lot for work, so I usually had the place to myself. The basement was fully finished. It had a kitchenette, a bedroom, and my workspace. It was cozy, but like any basement, it felt detached from the rest of the house. It was a Saturday night in November. A massive Pacific storm was hammering the coast. The rain was hitting the house sideways, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the siding. The wind was howling so loud the floorboards vibrated. I was working late, headphones on, editing a wedding video. Around 1 a.m., the power died. It didn't flicker. It just cut. My monitors went black. The hum of the dehumidifier stopped. The only light came from the lightning flashing outside the high, narrow basement windows. "Perfect," I muttered. I pulled my headphones off. The silence of the house, underneath the noise of the storm, was heavy. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight. No service. The basement walls were thick concrete, so I never got a signal down there. I figured a tree had taken out a line nearby. I decided to head upstairs to check the main breaker box in the garage. I stood up and walked toward the stairs. As I passed the small rectangular window well near the ceiling of the basement wall, I heard a sound. Thump. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, dull impact against the glass. I froze. I shined my phone light up at the window. It was ground level outside, meaning the window looked out directly onto the muddy flower bed. I stepped closer, squinting. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard for a split second. Pressed against the glass, staring down into my basement, was a face. It was a man. He was wearing a dark rain hood. His skin was pale and streaked with rain. His mouth was open slightly, revealing teeth that looked too big for his mouth. He wasn't just looking in. He was looking at me. He knew exactly where I was standing. I gasped and dropped my phone. When I scrambled to pick it up and shine the light again, the face was gone. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Did I imagine that? Was it a reflection? Then, I heard the sound that confirmed my worst nightmare. Creak. The sound of the front door opening upstairs. It wasn't forced. It sounded like a key turning or a lock being picked. Then, heavy, wet boots stepping onto the hardwood floor of the living room directly above my head. Thump. 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 There was more than one person. I tracked their movements by the creaking floorboards. They were spreading out. I was trapped. I had no cell service to call 911. The only exit from the basement was the staircase that led right up to the kitchen, where they were headed. Panic set in, cold and sharp. I needed to know what I was dealing with. Maybe I could sneak out the back door if they were distracted. I crept up the carpeted basement stairs, moving inch by inch, holding my breath. I reached the landing where the stairs turned. From here, I could see through the railing into the living room. The house was pitch black, but 3 beams of tactical flashlights were cutting through the gloom. I saw 3 men. They were dressed in dark rain gear, dripping wet. One of them was holding a crowbar. Another was holding a pistol. They weren't looting. They weren't looking at the TV or the expensive stereo system. They were standing in a circle, whispering. I pressed my ear against the wall to hear. "Clear the top floor," one voice hissed. It was deep and gravelly. "What about the guy?" another asked. "Jonah said the nephew lives downstairs," the first voice replied. "Go down."
"Drag him out."
My blood turned to ice. The nephew. They knew who I was. They knew I lived in the basement. This wasn't a random burglary. This was a hit. I backed down the stairs, my legs shaking so bad I almost fell. I couldn't go upstairs. I had to get out, now. I ran back to my bedroom. The only way out was the egress window, the one I had seen the face in. I climbed up onto my desk. The window was latched tight. I undid the lock, but the frame was swollen shut from the humidity. Above me, I heard the heavy boots walking toward the basement door. The handle turned. "It's stuck!" a voice yelled from the top of the stairs. I had locked the interior door earlier that night, out of habit. Bam! They kicked the door. I grabbed a heavy metal trophy from my shelf and smashed the basement window. Glass exploded outward into the mud. I didn't care about the jagged shards. I pulled myself up, scraping my stomach and arms, and slithered out into the pouring rain. As my feet hit the mud outside, I heard the basement door upstairs give way with a loud crack. "He's running!" someone shouted from inside the house. I didn't look back. I sprinted into the dense forest behind my aunt's house. I ran until my lungs burned, slipping on wet pine needles, crashing through thorn bushes. I made it to the neighbor's house a quarter mile away and pounded on their door until they let me in to call the police. When the sheriff arrived, the men were gone. They had taken my laptop, my hard drives, and my camera gear, but they left the jewelry and the cash in my aunt's room untouched. The police determined the power hadn't gone out naturally. They had pulled the meter from the outside of the house to kill the lights in the alarm system. I never found out who Jonah was or how they knew I was living there, but I moved out the next day. I live in a 4th-floor apartment in Seattle now. I don't do basements anymore, and I don't work with headphones on at night. Story 3. The Breach at Metro Storage. Story 3. The Breach at Metro Storage. I used to work the graveyard shift at a climate-controlled self-storage facility on the south side of Chicago. It was a massive, 4-story concrete building that used to be a meatpacking factory in the 1920s. Now it's just a maze of orange metal doors and long, fluorescent-lit hallways. The job was painfully boring. My station was a glass booth in the lobby, monitoring 64 camera feeds. Most nights, I just watched Netflix and did my homework. It was a Thursday in October. A severe thunderstorm was hammering the city. The rain was hitting the metal roof so hard it sounded like static on a radio. Around 2:45 a.m., the power died. The hum of the HVAC system cut out. The monitors went black. The facility plunged into darkness, save for the eerie, buzzing red glow of the emergency exit signs at the end of the long corridors. I sighed. I knew the protocol. I had to go to the electrical room in the back of the first floor to check the main breakers. I grabbed my heavy Maglite flashlight and stepped out of the booth. The silence in the building was oppressive. Without the fans running, the air felt stagnant and heavy. I started my patrol down the main corridor of the first floor. It stretches about 100 yards, lined with 10 by 10 units. As I walked, I heard a sound. Clang. It was metallic and sharp, like a tool dropping onto concrete. It came from aisle 4, about 50 feet ahead. I froze. I told myself it was just the storm rattling the loading bay doors. I shined my beam down aisle 4. Empty. Just rows of orange doors. But as I swung the light back, I saw something that made my stomach drop. For a split second, a beam of light crossed mine. It was faint, sweeping across the ceiling pipes at the far end of the hallway. I clicked my light off immediately. I stood in the red-tinted dark, holding my breath. Was that a reflection? I waited. Nothing. I decided to keep moving toward the breaker room, but I walked softer now, rolling my feet like I learned in track to stay quiet. As I passed the loading bay, a smell hit me. It was the smell of wet dog, stale tobacco, and rust. It was distinct, and out of place in a sterilized, climate-controlled building. I shined my light on the floor. There, on the polished gray concrete, was a trail of footprints. They were wet, muddy boot prints. They led from the loading dock door, which should have been alarmed, straight into the maze of units. Panic started to set in. I wasn't alone. I reached for my radio to call the off-site manager, but then I remembered the repeater on the roof was likely down without power. I was cut off. I decided to abandon the breaker check and head back to the office to use the landline. I turned around. From the darkness of the aisle I had just passed, I heard a whisper. It was harsh and urgent. He's turning back.
Cut him off.
My blood turned to ice. I didn't try to be quiet anymore. I broke into a run. As I sprinted past aisle 6, 2 figures stepped out from the shadows. They were dressed in dark hoodies and masks. One of them was holding a pair of massive bolt cutters. The other had a crowbar. They didn't shout. They didn't tell me to freeze. They just charged. The guy with the crowbar swung it at my head. I ducked just in time, and the metal bar clanged against the steel door of a storage unit, sparking in the dark. "Get him!" one of them growled. I scrambled backward, slipping on the wet floor, and took off running toward the fire exit at the end of the hall. I knew the layout better than they did. I took a sharp left into a narrow side corridor, then a right. I could hear their heavy boots pounding behind me, echoing off the metal walls. It sounded like a stampede. I reached the fire exit. I slammed into the push bar. It didn't budge. They had jammed it. I looked down. A wooden wedge was kicked tight under the door. The footsteps were getting closer. They were rounding the corner. I saw a service ladder leading up to the HVAC mezzanine. I jumped, grabbed the rung, and hauled myself up into the dark crawl space above the units, just as the two men skidded around the corner. I lay flat on the metal grating, looking down through the mesh. The men stopped right below me. I could see the tops of their heads. I could hear them breathing heavy, wet rasps. "Where did he go?" the crowbar guy hissed. "Check the office," the other said.
He has to loop back.
They ran back toward the lobby. I waited 5 minutes, shaking so hard I thought the grate would rattle. Then I climbed down, unjammed the fire door, and burst out into the rain. I ran to the gas station across the street and called 911. When the police cleared the building, the men were gone. They had cut the padlock on the loading dock door to get in. But here's the kicker. They hadn't broken into any storage units. Not a single lock was cut. They were waiting in the main corridor. The police think they cut the power externally to lure the security guard, me, away from the safety of the glass booth. They weren't there for the stuff in storage. They wanted the master keys and the access codes to the safe in the office. I quit the next day. I can't walk down a hallway of closed doors anymore without expecting someone to step out with a crowbar.